Okay, welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parasha. I'm Eli Weber. Today we have a huge zchut because we're not just starting a new sefer, which allows us to read the Ramban's Hakdama to the sefer. As we all know, the Ramban wrote a Hakdama to each of the Sfarim. Sefer Breshit is really a Hakdama to the whole Torah, but then he wrote for Shmot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and Devarim, and we'll get to learn together Devarim today. But in the background is the uniqueness of Sefer Devarim. I once was watching a certain kofer who was saying how, Sefer Devarim proves that the whole Torah wasn't given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like he was mechadesh, this whole idea. But the Ramban is sensitive to the idea, or what people might claim, that Moshe said things in Sefer Devarim that weren't from Hashem, and the Ramban is going to point out to us how that's not the case. There is a bit in the the Ramban struggles to find a structure of Sefer Devarim, as most people do. The Ramban, of course, understands that there are three separate speeches. There's Parshat Devarim, which goes into Va'etchanan. We'll see that inside. That's the first four prakim and 40 psukim. Then there's what people call the Ne'um of Chukimu Mishpatim, that goes, for 25 prakim. Then there's the end of the Sefer. Okay, but let's start from the very beginning with the Ramban's approach to Sefer Devarim and his Hakdama. Says the Ramban, HaSefer Hazeh Inyano Yadua, Shehu Mishneh Torah. Okay, says the Ramban, everybody knows it's called Mishneh Torah. Yivuar bo Moshe Rabbeinu l'dor hanichnas ba'aretz, rov mitzvot HaTorah hatzrichot liYisrael. Now, the Ramban knows it's called Mishneh Torah, but it's not really Mishneh Torah, right? There's no references to Bereshis. There's a few references to the end of Shmos. There's no references to Vayikra. There's some references to Bamidbar. It's not really a repetition of the Torah. So says the Ramban, the focus of Devarim are Rov mitzvot HaTorah hatzrichot liYisrael. Now this is a category of mitzvahs we don't really understand. They're the most necessary ones, but let's read. V'lo yazkir bo davar b'torat haKohanim. There's no mention of Vayikra. Lo b'maaseh haKarbanot. V'lo b'torat haKohanim. V'maasehem. Why? Shekvar bierotam lahem. Says the Ramban. HaKadosh Baruch Hu already told the Kohanim. V'haKohanim zrizim heim. Lo yitztarchu la'azhara achar azhara. Right, an important yisod for the Ramban. Kohanim are zrizim. They're very careful. If you tell them once, that's good enough for them. There's no reason to repeat it. Aval b'Yisrael, us or me, yazhir hamitzvot hanoagot b'hem pam achar pam, lahusif b'hen biur. Says the Ramban, there's much repetition in the Torah. Either lahusif b'hen biur, each time a new chiddush, upamim shelo yazkirotan. Right? Unlike Rashi, sometimes there's no reason for the repetition. Rak lazhirat Yisrael b'rov ha'azharot. Right? The fact is, it's also to worship Avodah Zarah. The more that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is worried about the fact that it's also to worship Avodah Zarah, the more times he tells us. Kimo she'avo b'sefer hazeh b'inyanei avodat gilulim azharot merubot zo achar zo v'tochachot v'kol pichadim asher yafchid otam kol onshei ha'averot. Right? The fact is, the more that we're worried, the more we're going to warn you. It's as simple as that. Okay, so that's the first thing. Many, many mitzvos that have to be warned over and over again because they're that important. Next, va'od. Yosif b'sefer hazeh k'tzat mitzvot shelo nizkru klal. Says the Ramban, there are, of course, new mitzvot. What does it mean, a new mitzvah? A mitzvah that wasn't mentioned before in the Torah. Now, the Ramban's going to make clear, it was mentioned to Moshe Rabbeinu. There's nothing new in Sefer Devarim. If Moshe Rabbeinu gives us a mitzvah in Sefer Devarim, it means he got it at Ohel Moed, he got it at Har Sinai. But we never got it. Why not? So first he gives you a short list, and it's certainly not exclusive. Kigon hayibum, vidin motzi shem. Motzi shem are not just being lashon hara. Motzi shem are being the technical isser when a husband has relations with his wife and then claims afterwards it wasn't her first time. Vahagerushin be'isha, getting divorced. Ve'edim zomamim. Right? Again, not false witnesses, but witnesses who make something up that was impossible for them to have been at. V'zulatan. Another good example of a new mitzvah in Sefer Devarim is benching. That's also new. So why are these here and not others? So first of all, says the Ramban, Ukvar nemru lo kulan b'sinai o ba'ol moed b'shana harishona kodem hameraglim. Says the Ramban, first thing you have to know is every single mitzvah in Sefer Devarim was already said to Moshe Rabbeinu. It was said to Moshe Rabbeinu in the first year, either at Har Sinai or Ohel Moed, before the sin of the Meraglim. Ki ba'arvot Moav lo nidchatshu lo ela divrei habrit kashen nitparesh bo. Right? Where they are now in Arvot Moav, God entered into a new covenant with Klal Yisrael, but not new substantive mitzvos. Va'al kein lo ne'amar b'sefer zeh vayidaber Hashem al Moshe limor tzavet b'nei Yisrael. Right now we get back to the Kofrim. Yes, it's true. There's no place in Sefer Devarim that it says vayidaber Hashem al Moshe limor tzavet b'nei Yisrael daber el b'nei Yisrael va'amar talehem. It's whatever it is. Aval lo nichtavu hamitzvot b'sfarim harishonim sheidaber im yotzei Mitzrayim ki ulai lo nohagu b'otan hamitzvot rak ba'aretz af al pin shehein chovat haguf. Right? There's a huge chiddush here. Says the Ramban, we think to ourselves, there's two types of mitzvos. There are mitzvos that are tluyos ba'aretz, and there are mitzvos haguf. Right? I put on tefillin wherever I am in the world. It has nothing to do with being in Eretz Yisrael. I take Trumas U'Maizus only in Eretz Yisrael. Says the Ramban, there's possibly a third group of mitzvot, which are mitzvot that are chovas haguf, but only were noeg when we came into Eretz Yisrael. The Ramban takes seriously, Lamaskan, I'm not so sure, takes seriously the possibility that we weren't supposed to bench until we came into Eretz Yisrael. It's a mitzvah, tluya b'aretz. No, but certain mitzvot that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us only came into effect when we entered Eretz Yisrael. As we've mentioned before, and we'll mention over and over again, the Ramban's love for Eretz Yisrael and his sense that all mitzvot are really only in Eretz Yisrael, it's something we should remind ourselves of. Rav Lichtenstein once told me that when he picked up Rav Hutner in an early year that he lived in Israel, he picked up Rav Hutner from the airport. So Rav Hutner said, we have to go, it was the afternoon, we have to go someplace so I could put on my tefillin. So Rav Lichtenstein said, you didn't put on tefillin on the plane? So he said, those were tefillin of chutz la'aretz. Right? Rav Hutner was making the same point the Raman's made. There's something about doing mitzvot in Eretz Yisrael that's different than doing mitzvot in chutz la'aretz. Okay. Here's another possibility. Perhaps these mitzvos appear in Eretz Yisrael, o mipnei she'einan tidirot. They're not that regular, right? People don't get divorced all the time. Eidim zomim is certainly not a common mitzvah. The ones that I've mentioned before don't seem like they're the mitzvos, motzi shemra, yibum, right? They're not common mitzvos. So says the Ramban, maybe that's why they left it for Sefer Devarim. Okay, v'terem sheyatchil b'biyur HaTorah. Now says the Ramban, Moshe Rabbeinu is going to explain to us the Torah. We'll do that in a second. But before that, hitchil lahochicham ulahazkir lahem avonotehem kama yamruhu bamidbar. It's almost like the Ramban is saying Moshe got distracted. The idea was to tell them the mitzvos. But first he's standing in front of them. It's the end of his life. He can't miss the opportunity to give them some rebuke. And they should also know that for all of their misbehavior, HaKadosh Baruch Hu always treated them with mercy. Why? This is a critical point. Moshe wants Klal Yisrael to understand the following, that no matter how much they misbehave, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always going to help them, is always going to be on their side. Va'od, sheyochichu bidvarav shelo yachzru lekilkulam, pen yisafu b'chol chatotam, ulechazek lahem b'hodia otam, ki b'midat rachamim yitnahegi mohem la'olam. It could be you're standing there at Ever HaYarden and Moshe's talking to you, and you think to yourself, you know what? It's all good. It's all great. But I'm going to sin again. I know I'm going to sin again. I'm just not that good a person. Moshe Rabbeinu is emphasizing, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows that. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to help you. He's going to have mercy on you. Shelo yomar adam lo yuchal lareshet ha'aretz. What's the point of me going into Eretz Yisrael? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to be mitnaheg with me, b'midat hadin, there's no purpose. What's the benefit? It says, no, it's not going to happen that way. Ki ein adam asher lo yachata. Of course human beings sin, right? But HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to forgive you. Umiyad tiyeh midat hadin mitucha kinegdo v'novad. A person might think the midat hadin is going to swallow me up. V'lachein hodiyam Moshe Rabbeinu ki HaKadosh Baruch Hu rachaman malei rachamim ki haslicha v'hamechila mimenu yitbarach, etc., etc. Right? This is a significant point that I think is overlooked. The Ramban's talking about the tochacha. He's not the tochacha. The Ramban's talking about things Bnei Yisrael have done wrong, and he's about to enter into a discussion of these things. But says the Ramban, he's not doing it for what you would think tochacha is usually used for. He's doing it to tell you, you've sinned in the past, probably you'll sin in the future. But know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows that. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not, it's not that he's not going to punish you, but there's a difference between Midat Hadin and Midat HaRachamim. Midat Hadin is the Shurat Hadin. If a person sins, he's punished. If a person's Chayiv Misa, he's Chayiv Misa. But Midat HaRachamim doesn't mean that God's not going to punish you. But it means that God's going to find a way for you to continue, as we see in the Torah all the time. Okay? So that's the Ramban's introduction. Major points. The Ramban makes clear, Sefer Devarim is not a recap of the Torah. All mitzvahs of Kohanim don't have to be mentioned here because Kohanim is Rizim Heim. Mitzvahs that apply to all of Klal Yisrael are mentioned here. Maybe because they're only Noah when we come into Eretz Yisrael, so they're connected to that. They're a new mitzvot, right? They're not such popular mitzvot. Maybe so they're not mentioned previously in the Torah because they're kind of, mitzvot that come because of certain circumstances. You want to divorce your wife, you need to have yibum, Eidim Zom show up, but they're not common mitzvot. Okay, but the main thing, says the Ramban, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to treat us with midas harachamim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to continue loving us. Don't be afraid of going into Eretz Yisrael. Okay. With that as the intro, we come to the very beginning of the parsha. Very beginning of the parsha, a famous pasuk, Eila hadvarim asher diber Moshe kol Yisrael be'ever hayarden ba'midbar ba'arava mol suf bein paron vein tofel v'lavana chatzerot v'di zahav. Okay, now, what's this the introduction to? It sounds like an introduction, Eila hadvarim. And then a fact, Achara sayom mechorev derech har seir ad kadesh barnea. It's not that long. Vayhi ba'arba'im shana ba'ashtei asar chodesh be'echad la'chodesh. Right, Moshe standing on what day? Moshe standing on Rosh Chodesh Shvat. Certainly, if the idea that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away on Zayin Adar, which we accept as fact, if it is a fact, then that means this is 37 days before Moshe Rabbeinu dies. Just if you want to place it, how long did every Sefer take is an interesting game that people want to play from time to time. The answer to the question about Sefer Devarim is 37 days. We know it because it's the first pasuk and it's the last pasuk. That's when Moshe died. Okay, but now what's going on? So if you look, we'll start in the middle of the first Ramban on the Parsha. The Ramban's trying to give us a sense for what the plan is and what Moshe Rabbeinu is doing. And he says, V'nimshechu divrei ha'pticha hazot ad shehishlim bahem b'pasuk v'shamarta es chukav ve'et mitzvotav asher anochi mitzavcha hayom asher yitav l'chol v'necha achrecha u'leman ta'arich yamim alo adama asher mashokecha noten l'cha kol hayamim. Where is that pasuk? That is in Perek Daled, pasuk Mem. It's next week's parsha. It's Va'eschanan. But the Ramban is telling us the introductory speech of Sefer Devarim goes until pasuk Mem of Perek Daled, and then starts a new speech. Az Yavdil Moshe Shalosh Arim Be'ever Hayarden, and then that's kind of an in-between thing. Then Vayikra Moshe El Kol Yisrael Vayomer Alem Shema Yisrael Tachukim Ve'et HaMishpatim Asher Anochi Dover Ba'oznechem Hayom Ulemadatem Otam Ushmartem La'asotam. Says the Ramban, Moshe Rabbeinu is going to give us 4.5 prakim of introduction, of history, of narrative, and then when you get to Perek Hey of Sefer Devarim, we're going to get a new speech. Shema Yisrael Tachukim Ve'et HaMishpatim, right? The speech that people refer to as the Ne'um Chukim U'Mishpatim. Okay, but what happens before? So he says, he's giving this kind of introduction. Az kara Moshe kol Yisrael asher hayu lefanav va'amar Shema Yisrael tachukim ve'et hamishpatim asher anochi dover ba'oznechem hayom. Why does this matter? V'hitchil bibiur HaTorah aseret hadibrot. Then, of course, comes aseret hadibrot. Sheyishmeu otam biviur mipi hamekabel otam mipiv shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe, when he says Aseret HaDibrot in Parshas Va'etchanan, he's not just somebody, He's the person who got it directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu at Har Sinai. Through him, the rest of us got it. Now we're hearing it again from Moshe Rabbeinu. Va'acharei kein hodiyam yichud Hashem Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Right after Aseret HaDibros comes Shema. V'chol hamitzvot shebesefer hazeh. We start with, it's a whole discussion whether Aseret HaDibrot has some kind of din of the most important 10 mitzvahs in the Torah. I think it's unlikely, but it doesn't matter. Aseret HaDibros, Shema, these are the foundations of our faith. Says the Ramban, that's going to be the first speech of Moshe Rabbeinu. Ulekach yefaresh bekan asher diber Moshe el kol Yisrael. V'sham vayikra Moshe el kol Yisrael. Why kol Yisrael? Why is this so important? Says the Ramban, ki bi'ur HaTorah v'tashlum hamitzvot tzarich liyot b'ma'amad kol Yisrael kasher haya b'matan HaTorah. Ramban says, it's like Moshe's talking to a few people. Moshe's giving the Torah to Kol Yisrael. And because Moshe Rabbeinu got carried away in the first 4 prakim in telling us certain histories and certain facts, Chazar HaKatuv Limakom Shepasak B'tchila Biur HaTorah V'amar V'zot HaTorah Shesam Moshe Lifnei B'nei Yisrael. Right? You wouldn't think, I'll just flip there for a second, if I ask you, where do you find the pasuk of Zot HaTorah? It's not something that pops out at you because it's not something that's really part of the narrative. But says the Ramban, it's in Perek Daled. If I could find it. Yes. It's strange. At the very end of Perek Daled, you have Ari Miklat, which we could talk about next week. Why specifically Ari Miklat slip in here? But right at the end of Ari Miklat, you have the psukim that we're talking about. Shema Yisrael atachukim v'eta mishpatim, v'zot HaTorah, right in the middle of it. Vet ramot b'gilad ha'gadi vet golon b'abashon v'amnashi. V'zot HaTorah shesam Moshe l'finei b'nei Yisrael. Eila ha'idot v'achukim v'amishpatim. So I've heard many people talk about, why is it that the pasuk of Zot HaTorah appears in the parsha of Ari Miklat? But I think the Ramban's saying, that's not a good question. It's not a question, why it appears in Ari Miklat. It appears as an introduction to the next speech. Moshe Rabbeinu was not just telling us some things. He's giving us the Torah as was given to him by HaKadosh Baruch Hu at Har Sinai. And he's giving it to all of Klal Yisrael because he's a shaliach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That which HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him, he's giving to us. But again, nothing new. There's no mitzvah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't give to Moshe Rabbeinu either at Har Sinai or at Ohel Moed. Now, you could ask, and I don't have an answer right now, why it would be that if Moshe got the mitzvah of Yibum in the first year, so why didn't he give it to Klal Yisrael? I don't know. There's a lot of answers to that. It could very well be that he did give it to Klal Yisrael, but it's not in the Torah till now. Maybe it wasn't necessary till now. Maybe there was no situation of Yibum till now. It doesn't matter. But says the Ramban, these are as much a part of the Torah as is any other part of the Torah. Okay, so that's more or less the Ramban's introduction. That Moshe Rabbeinu started talking. When he started talking, he was reminded of history. And so there is an introduction, right? The main points he's reminded of is appointing Shoftim, which we think of as being Yisro's idea. Yisro's name doesn't appear in Parashas Devarim. Moshe Rabbeinu presents it, but he presents it in a slightly different way. Then, of course, the reason, it was impossible for Moshe to ignore this, the reason they're there is because of Chet HaMeraglim, right? That's just the things that kind of distract Moshe from his main point, from the Chukim u'Mishpatim, that Moshe has to tell us in this week's Parsha. Now, very briefly, the story of the Meraglim was more or less covered in detail by the Ramban in Parsha Shlach, right? And there I think the Ramban talks about the fact that Parsha Shlach is what happened, and Parshas Devarim is how Moshe recalls it, right? The big difference being that in Parshas Shlach, God tells us to send the Meraglim, and in Parshas Devarim, we think it's a good idea, right? And Moshe says, Vayitav beinai adavar, some insane thing. Moshe, knowing it just cost him 40 years of his life that were in the Midbar, because the Meraglim admits the truth, which is, I thought it was a good idea. It turns out it wasn't a good idea. It's perhaps the most honest pasuk in the Torah, right? Because Moshe knows it was complete tragedy, and yet he says, "Vayitav b'nai hadavar." Okay, so very quickly, the Ramban in pasuk Chav Hey of Perek Aleph says, "Vayomru tova haaretz asher Hashem Elokeinu notein lanu." Right, and the Meraglim came back and they said, "You know what? The land is great." Mihem shamru tovata. Who says it was great? Says Rashi, Yoshua v'Kalev. Lashon Rashi. Vani tameh, says the Ramban. I don't get it. Imkain ma hata'ana hazot alehem. What's the sin of Klal Yisrael? V'ra'ui sheya'aminu la'asara yoter min hashnayim. 10 people say it's a great land. 2 people say it's a great land. 10 people say it's a disaster. So of course you have to listen to the 10. So he thinks that's not what happened. Ulai ta'an alehem kevon she'akadosh baruch hu di'etchem shehi eretz tova ugdolei hashluchim v'hatzadikim shebohem avheim me'idim kain. Maybe he's saying God says it's great. Yoshua and Kalev say it's great. Kain haya lahem lahamin ki achirim mipnei morech lev amru ma she'amru. It could be that, these people were terrified, so they said something bad about it, but we should have believed the other people. But the Ramban doesn't like that. He says, V'hanachon ma she'perashti sham, what I explained in Pasha Shlach. Shekulam hodu lifnei Moshe v'Aaron v'chol ha'ida v'amru banu el ha'aretz asher shlachton v'gam zavad chalav udvash hi v'zeh pirya. All 12 Meraglim said it's a great land. V'hinei kulam b'haskama achat b'tovat ha'aretz aval b'chozek ha'amim ha'hem heimasu at levavam. Says the Ramban, all the Meraglim, they couldn't reject the fact it's a great land. The problem was, the sin was, the Meraglim said, we'll never win. Right? The people are too strong for us. Yoshua and Kalev said, of course we'll win. Va'acharei kain. Now this is repeating something in Shlach, but it's fantastic. Says the Ramban, as he does many times, the way I see it, the Ramban closes his eyes and imagines the situation. So they're all standing in front of Moshe Rabbeinu. So even the 10 spies who were sinners, it's Moshe Rabbeinu. They're intimidated. So they say, yeah, it's a great land, but we're a little concerned about this. Okay. But later on, va'acharei kain birotam ki Yoshua v'Kalev yichazku at libam lemilchama ba'u v'amru amraglim el b'nei Yisrael shalo b'fnei Moshe. Now it's later on at night. V'otziu diba al haaretz shehi eretz ochelat yoshveha. Now v'teiraginu ba'aleim v'tomru b'sinat Hashem. Right? They didn't do that in front of Moshe. They didn't want to say this in front of Moshe. They were intimidated. Instead, they said it themselves. V'gam ha'am lo yaskiru, etc., etc. So, again, here, the sense you get is that there are these unnamed people, because in Devarim they're unnamed, who sinned, and Bnei Yisrael followed them, and that was a disaster. You don't get the detail that you got in Pasha Shlach, mostly because Moshe is just recounting 38 and a half years later the story to remind us of why we're still in the Midbar. But that gets us to the last point, which everybody asks because it's such an obvious point. Says the pasuk, he's describing the sin of the Meraglim and the whole problem, and then he says as follows: Gam bihi tanaf Hashem biglalchem lemor gam atalav tavosham. I also said God got angry at me because of you. Gam bihi tanaf Hashem biglalchem. It was your fault. It sounds, I'm sorry to say, it sounds a little dishonest, right? Everybody knows why Moshe and Aaron didn't go into Eretz Yisrael. And it has to do nothing with the Meraglim and everything to do with Mei Meriva, right? Where we were not lahakdisheni da'inechem lemor, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes 1,000% clear over and over again in the Torah, the reason why Moshe and Aaron are not going into Eretz Yisrael is because they hit the rock twice and they were not Mekadesh Shem Shemaim in the way that they were supposed to. Okay, and a whole discussion, we'll come back to that in a second. So why is Moshe blaming Klal Yisrael? Right? God forbid, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying something that's not true. So Ramban wants to deal with it in 2 separate pieces. Pasuk Lamed Zayin. Gam bihi tanaf Hashem biglalchem. Yomar. Hinei chatatchem asher asitem ba'etahi ba'meraglim min Naomi kem ha'aretz hatova. Right? The first thing is we all know. The reason why you, Klal Yisrael, didn't go into Eretz Yisrael till now is because of the sin of the Meraglim. Va'od hosaftem lachato b'pam acheret ad sheminatem gamoti mila'avor. Oh, by the way, not connected to the Meraglim, you're the reason that Aaron and I are not going into Eretz Yisrael. Right? Why? Had you not complained that Mei Merivah, you not needed the water, you not forced us into that situation, God would never have been angry at us. Ki ratzah lahazkir yachad onesh kol hanimna'im me'avor el haaretz, ki akol bigramat avonotehem. Right? It's all because of your sins. Yes, they're two separate sins, but your two sins are causing me not to go into Eretz Yisrael. Ukedeshi yazkir kan inyan Yehoshua, ki hu ya'avor mipnei shem milei acharei Hashem kechavero, v'yizke od shi yanchil haaretz l'dor hasheni, ba'avur shenanash Moshe v'nigzar alav shelo ya'avor. We want to get everything in together. So says Moshe Rabbeinu, first of all, the reason we've been in the Midbar all these years is because of the sin of the Meraglim. Also, I'm not going into Eretz Yisrael because of you. Not because of the sin of the Meraglim. I'm not going to Eretz Yisrael because of Mei Merivah. But that was also your fault. It's true, I sinned, or God claimed that I sinned at Mei Merivah, but that was also your fault. And by the way, that's why I'm introducing to you Yoshua now, who's going to take you into Eretz Yisrael, who's going to be manchel the land to you. He's getting my job because Gam bihi tanaf Hashem biglalchem lemor. Vihine, he's kir kol ha'ma'asahu zulatim magefat hamraglim atzmam, v'gam lo he's kir hadiba, ki lo yidaber bignai hayichidim, aval yochich et harabim shekulam chatu v'kulam ne'enshu. A really, really important point, says the Ramban. He's not giving you all the details and all the lashon hara of chet hameraglim. That's not the purpose. That's parsha shlach. He's letting you know there was a sin, but he's giving you the tochacha that's worthy of everyone. Right? You sinned. You. It's not really you. It's your parents who sinned. But he's reminded that's what matters. The details don't matter so much. That's a klal in Sefer Devarim. But now our point again. V'tam biglalchem ki ravu v'nei Yisrael at Hashem. Bnei Yisrael complained about God. V'ira kol zeh ba'avur merivatechem. Right? And now all my troubles started because of your fight with God. Az yirmoz shaya hakas al Moshe al Aaron kasher hiku asela pamayim lifnei ha'am v'lo asu kasher nitztava. Then we sinned. V'ha'am hir haru b'davar. V'hu ma she'amar al asher lo kidashtem oti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. It's a beautiful point. It says the Ramban, the sin of Mei Merivah and hitting the rock only occurred because Yan lo ha'amantam bi lahakdishen le'bnei Yisrael. But it's you who refused to feel a moment of Kiddush Hashem. You, the Jewish people, because you assumed poorly, right? The Ramban in previous parshas explains the sin was that Moshe Rabbeinu Ki'ilu took responsibility for it when it was really God, right? It was really God who brought the water out of the rock. But all this only happened because Bnei Yisrael didn't give Moshe the benefit of the doubt. They didn't give God the benefit of the doubt. So when Moshe says, Hashem hitanaf bi biglalchem lemor, what he means is the lack of a Kiddush Hashem was you, because you thought the worst of what we were doing, so we suffered for it. Now, what about the real answer? I think it's here, but the Ramban doesn't really say it, which is they wouldn't have been in the Midbar. There wouldn't have been a Mei Merivah if it wasn't for the Chet HaMeraglim. Right? The only reason there was a sin of Mei Merivah was because the Meraglim sinned, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, "Fine, you're not going to go into Eretz Yisrael." I assume that somewhere in the middle of this Ramban he means this, that Biglalchem we would have been in Eretz Yisrael already. My sin, it's true, I sinned, says Moshe at Mei Merivah. I hit the rock. And there's all these details in which you could have helped me out and you didn't. But at the end of the day, the only reason I hit the rock was because we weren't in Eretz Yisrael, because we needed water. Why? Because of the Chet HaMeraglim, because of your sin. Okay, that's it for today. Again, we did some basic ideas of the Ramban in terms of Sefer Devarim. We did the intro, which was fascinating, where he tries to explain the purpose of the Sefer. We looked quickly at the difference between Shlach and Devarim in terms of the description of the sin of the Meraglim, where Shlach is the actual sin and Devarim are just the lessons we can learn from it. And then finally we dealt with the specific question of why Moshe seems to say that he and Aaron were kept out of Eretz Yisrael because of Klal Yisrael. Basically the Ramban says, he's describing the sins and he's describing the punishments and he's describing the roles of Yoshua, so everything sort of gets put together. But there is a theory where Klal Yisrael caused it and the Big Lalchem was because of them. Okay, that's it for today. Shabbat Shalom. See you next week.